March 8, 1941, 11:32 p.m. Inside the smoke-filled Apollo Theater, the jazz didn't just stop, it died.
200 witnesses watched a diamond bullet of saliva arch through the air, catching the stage lights before striking the cheek of the most dangerous man in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson.
In the world of high-stakes crime, this wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of war. The shooter? Vincent "Vinny" Spit Calabri, a psychopathic enforcer for the Genovese family. The crowd braced for a thriller movie shootout, but Bumpy didn't reach for a gun. He didn't even yell. He simply wiped his face with a linen napkin and whispered 3 words that launched the most terrifying investigation in underworld history. Count to 5. 0. Quote. Most people thought it was a threat. They were wrong. It was a mathematical prophecy. Exactly 50 minutes later, the investigations into white-collar crime and street violence alike would hit a gruesome wall. Vinny Calabri wouldn't just be dead. He'd be delivered to the 5 families in exactly 50 pieces. This is the suspense-filled true story of how one man's patience turned a public humiliation into a masterpiece of criminal strategy. Harlem in 1941 was a masterpiece of contradictions, a place where the air tasted like expensive gin and cheap desperation. By day, the neighborhood was the crown jewel of black culture, a sprawling landscape of brownstones and boulevards where the Harlem Renaissance hadn't just ended. It had evolved into a living, breathing pulse. But as the sun dipped below the skyline, the glamour of the Savoy Ballroom and the high-pitched trills of the Jazz Age collided with a much darker reality. This was the era of the Great Depression's long shadow, a time when white banks slammed their doors shut on black dreams, and the law was often just another gang in a different uniform. In the center of this storm stood Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, a man who looked more like a university professor than a kingpin. While the Italian mafia viewed Harlem as a ripe fruit ready to be plucked, Bumpy saw it as a fortress that required an architect. He didn't just rule the streets, he engineered them. To the federal authorities, he was a primary target in a growing investigation into organized crime. But to the residents of 125th Street, he was the bank and the shield. Bumpy's operation was a masterclass in white-collar crime masked by street-level grit. He ran the numbers racket with the precision of a Wall Street firm, pulling in millions of pennies from people who had nothing else to bet on but hope. Yet that money didn't just vanish into offshore accounts. It flowed back into the community like a lifeline. He was the man who paid the back rent for the widow on Lenox Avenue before the marshals arrived. He was the secret benefactor who ensured the local clinics had medicine when the city turned a blind eye. This dual life created a suspense that hung over Harlem like a thick fog. Bumpy walked the pavement with a quiet, terrifying grace, moving through crowds that parted not just out of fear, but out of a profound, earned reverence. He was the only thing standing between his people and the predatory expansion of the 5 families. In this high-stakes thriller of urban survival, Bumpy understood that his power wasn't just in the blade he carried, but in the loyalty he bought with every gesture of protection. He was the architect of a shadow government, and in 1941, his blueprints were about to be stained in blood. The investigation into his reign would eventually reveal a man who played the game of power better than the masters who invented it, proving that in Harlem, the only thing more dangerous than a man with a gun was a man with a plan. The roots of the 50-piece message weren't planted in the concrete of Harlem, but in the thick red clay of South Carolina, 1916. Long before he was a kingpin, Ellsworth Johnson was just a boy standing in the shadow of a giant, his father, William. In the Jim Crow South, life for a black man was a daily exercise in high-stakes suspense, where one wrong look could trigger a lethal investigation by men wearing badges and hoods. On a humid afternoon that smelled of rain and impending crime, the boy watched as two white police officers cornered his father in the middle of the street. With the cruel nonchalance of characters in a gritty thriller movie, they pushed the dignified man to his knees. Young Bumpy's world tilted. He felt the weight of a jagged rock in his pocket, his small fingers curling around it with the heat of raw emotion. This was the moment of the reaction, a primal, hot-blooded urge to strike back, to let the rock fly and watch the blood spill. But as he prepared to lunge, his father's eyes met his. There was no fear in William's gaze, only a terrifying, quiet command. Don't. One of the officers sneered, leaned down, and spat directly onto William's forehead. The boy watched the liquid crawl down his father's face, a precursor to the diamond bullet he would receive decades later. The officers laughed and walked away, leaving a man kneeling in the mud and a son trembling with fury. But that night, as the house sat in a heavy, suspenseful silence, William didn't speak of revenge. He spoke of the response. He explained that reaction is what the enemy wants. It is an emotional outburst that leads straight to a prison cell or a shallow grave. A response, however, is a cold-blooded calculation. It is the art of the long game, the strategic patience of an investigation that waits for the perfect moment to dismantle an opponent completely. "I'm not angry because I'm weak," his father whispered, his voice steady as a heartbeat in a thriller. "I'm patient because I'm smart. The day will come when we don't have to kneel, but you have to live long enough to see it." In that moment, the boy buried his anger and replaced it with a blueprint. He realized that while white-collar crime and street violence were the tools of the trade, strategy was the only true master. He learned that the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one reaching for his gun in a fit of rage. It's the one who wipes the mud from his face, smiles, and begins to count. Decades later, Vinnie Calabrese would learn that Bumpy Johnson never forgot a lesson, and he never, ever reacted. He only responded. While Bumpy was building a kingdom of loyalty in the shadows of Harlem, a very different kind of investigation was being conducted 4,000 miles away. In a sun-drenched villa overlooking the Bay of Naples, Vito Genovese sat in forced exile, pacing like a caged predator. To the Italian authorities, he was a wealthy businessman escaping American prosecution. To the underworld, he was the architect of a global crime syndicate that operated with the cold efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. Vito wasn't interested in the street-level grit of a thriller movie. He was focused on the bottom line of white-collar crime, and his ledgers showed a massive, black-inked leak coming from Upper Manhattan. Harlem was generating millions in numbers racket revenue, but thanks to Bumpy Johnson, not a cent of it was flowing back to the Genovese coffers. Vito knew that a standard hit wouldn't suffice. In his world, murder was a business expense, but public humiliation was a hostile takeover. Through a series of coded messages and high-stakes suspense, he reached across the Atlantic to his brother Michael with a mandate that would change the landscape of the New York underworld. "Don't just kill him," the order whispered through the phone lines. "Break the myth. Show Harlem their king is just a man who can be stepped on." To execute this psychological warfare, they needed a specific kind of monster, someone whose reputation for cruelty was a crime in itself. They chose Vincent "Vinny Spit" Calabrese. Calabrese was a 240-pound slab of arrogance who treated human dignity like a cigarette butt to be crushed. He wasn't a strategist or a student of Sun Tzu. He was a blunt force instrument who specialized in the ultimate act of degradation. He had earned his moniker through a series of brutal investigations into internal dissent, where he would beat men into the dirt and then spit on them to signal their total insignificance. To the Genovese family, the spit was more than a gesture. It was a branding iron. By sending Calibri into the heart of the Apollo, the Mafia was betting that Bumpy's response would be an emotional, reckless reaction that would trigger a war Bumpy couldn't win. They were treating the King of Harlem like a character in a low-budget thriller, unaware that they were actually walking into a masterfully orchestrated investigation of their own. Vinnie Calibri believed he was the one delivering the message, never realizing that in Bumpy's world, the moment the spit left his mouth, he had already become a ghost. The Genovese family prided themselves on their airtight security and their mastery of the shadows, but they had overlooked the most basic rule of a successful criminal investigation. Never ignore the person holding the broom. In the smoke-choked rooms of the Mulberry Street Social Club, the titans of the underworld spoke with a reckless lack of suspense, treating the elderly black man emptying their ashtrays like a ghost in a threadbare uniform. His name was Marcus, a man who had spent 62 years perfecting the art of being invisible. While the captains mapped out their hostile takeover, and Michael Genoveso laughed about the upcoming humiliation of Harlem's king, Marcus was conducting his own high-stakes surveillance. He didn't need hidden microphones or the sophisticated tools of a white-collar crime task force. He simply listened with the focused intensity of a man whose life depended on it. Marcus possessed a mind like a steel trap, a library of secrets gathered while he mopped floors and polished brass. He heard the date. He heard the location. He heard Vinnie Calibri's guttural boast about the diamond bullet he intended to fire at Bumpy's reputation. To the Mafia, Marcus was furniture. To Bumpy Johnson, he was the most vital asset in his intelligence network. Within hours of the meeting's conclusion, the information had traveled through the hidden arteries of the city, reaching Bumpy's office with the speed of a thriller movie's plot twist. Most men, upon learning they were to be publicly spat upon in 3 weeks, would have let their emotions override their strategy. They would have sent a hit squad to Mulberry Street to paint the walls red. But Bumpy remained in a state of chilling, calculated calm. He didn't want a messy shootout. He wanted a surgical response that would serve as a permanent deterrent. This 3-week lead time was a gift, a window to orchestrate a counter-investigation so thorough it would leave the 5 families paralyzed. While Vinnie Calibri practiced his arrogance in front of a mirror, Bumpy began to draft the blueprints for a nightmare. He meticulously planned every second of the countdown, choosing his location, his team, and his tools. He wasn't just preparing for a night at the theater. He was preparing a coffin. The suspense began to build not because Bumpy was afraid of what was coming, but because he knew exactly how it would end. He sat in his darkened office, the smoke from his cigar curling like a phantom, already seeing the 50 packages that would soon be scattered across the boroughs. The trap was set. The ghost had spoken, and the Mafia's master plan had unknowingly become their own death warrant. In the high-stakes game of criminal investigations, a leader is only as effective as the shadows he deploys. To execute a counter-move that would play out like the climax of a psychological thriller, Bump didn't call for a mob of street soldiers. He summoned 3 specialists who operated on the razor's edge of suspense. They met in a dimly lit basement in Sugar Hill, a room that smelled of gun oil and the cold metallic tang of impending violence. These were the men who formed Bumpy's Hammer, and tonight, their blueprints didn't involve a simple hit. They were there to perform an anatomical dissection of the Genovese family's pride. First was Junie Bird, the tracker. In any other life, he could have been a top-tier detective in a white-collar crime unit, but in Harlem, he used his genius to map the movements of every predator in the city. He didn't just follow people. He memorized the rhythm of their lives, the timing of their traffic stops, and the subtle flickers of their fear. Then there was Illinois Gordon, a man of terrifying physical presence whose silence was more ominous than any threat. He was the heavy machinery, the blunt force required to ensure that once the trap snapped shut, no amount of struggling could pry it open. Finally, there was Raymond "Quick" Lewis, the technician. If this were a thriller movie, Quick would be the one dismantling the security system with surgical precision. He possessed a cold, detached expertise in the logistics of the cleanup, viewing a body not as a person, but as a series of components to be managed. Bumpy looked at the three of them, the light from a single bulb carving deep canyons into his face. He didn't speak of murder or hot-blooded revenge. Instead, he spoke with the chilling clarity of a forensic auditor. "The Italians think they can humiliate us and walk back to Mulberry Street to celebrate," Bumpy whispered, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "They want to show the world that Harlem is a neighborhood of victims. We are going to show them it is a neighborhood of consequences." He laid out the mandate with the cold logic of a white-collar crime investigation. They weren't just going to eliminate Vinnie Calabri, they were going to dismantle him. Every minute of the 50-minute countdown Bumpy planned to give him was to be accounted for in the final package. The mission wasn't to kill a man, it was to dissect the very idea of mafia invincibility. "I want him taken in the 3-second window when the lights hit the corner of 126th, Bumpy instructed, his eyes locking onto his team with absolute certainty. "And I want him back in 50 pieces before the sun hits the Hudson. No witnesses, no mistakes, just a message so absolute it never needs to be repeated." The hammer was ready. The suspense of the wait was over, and the clock was about to strike midnight for Vinnie Calabri. The atmosphere inside the Apollo Theater on the night of March 8th was a masterpiece of manufactured suspense. To any casual observer, Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson was simply a man of leisure, enjoying the velvet vocals of Ella Fitzgerald. But to those who understood the mechanics of a criminal investigation, he was a predator in a state of perfect stillness. Bumpy sat at table 7, his posture as sharp as a thriller movie protagonist, radiating a calm that seemed to push back against the smoke-filled chaos of the room. He wasn't there to be entertained. He was there to host an ending. He knew the Genovese hit was coming, and he knew the exact moment the diamond bullet would be fired. While the jazz band swung through its set, Bumpy's hands moved with the rhythmic precision of a forensic technician. He reached for a crisp, white linen napkin resting beside his plate. His fingers, steady and devoid of the tremors that usually plague men facing a public crime, began to fold. It wasn't the idle fidgeting of a nervous man. It was a ritual. He creased the fabric with surgical intent, following a blueprint only he could see. With every tuck and every sharp angle, the linen began to lose its identity as a dining accessory. Slowly, it morphed into a miniature hollow vessel, a perfect, snow-white coffin. He placed the fabric casket on the mahogany table, aligning it perfectly with the edge of his plate. It was a silent, white-collar crime prophecy sitting in plain sight. Bumpy wasn't surprised when he felt the sudden shift in the room's temperature, nor when the heavy, arrogant footsteps of Vincent "Vinnie" Spit Calabri began to thud toward his table. He didn't look up when the music faltered, or when the ice stopped clinking in the glasses of 200 petrified witnesses. He simply stared at the napkin coffin he had built. The suspense peaked as Calabri's shadow stretched over the table like a shroud. This was the moment the Mafia believed would be the start of Bumpy's investigation into his own downfall. But as Bumpy finally raised his eyes to meet the enforcer's gaze, there was no shock, no fear, and no reaction. There was only the cold, hard response of a man who had already seen the finish line. The spit was coming, the humiliation was imminent, and the 50-minute clock was a fraction of a second away from its first tick. Bumpy looked at the napkin, then at the man who would soon fill its metaphorical dimensions, and he smiled. The theater was about to become a crime scene, and Bumpy Johnson was the only one who knew that the casket on the table had already been measured for the man standing over it. The moment the diamond bullet struck Bumpy Johnson's cheek, the atmosphere in the Apollo didn't just change, it shattered. Yet, as Vincent Calabri pivoted on his heel and sauntered toward the exit, he felt like a god in a tailored suit. He had just committed the ultimate crime against the King of Harlem and walked away without a scratch. To Calabri, Bumpy's quiet command to count to 50 inches was the desperate rambling of a broken man, a pathetic attempt to save face in front of a crowd. As he stepped out onto the cool pavement of 125th Street, he didn't realize he was entering the most high-stakes suspense sequence of his life. He began to walk with the swagger of a man who believed the investigation into his dominance was already over, unaware that his every stride was being measured by a ghost. Calabri moved through Harlem like a colonizer, laughing with his 4 bodyguards, oblivious to the fact that the street he thought he had conquered were actually a massive, living trap. He was currently enjoying his 50 minutes of grace, a brief window of existence granted by the very man he had just humiliated. Behind him, the 3 shadows, Junie Bird, Illinois Gordon, and Quick Lewis, melted into the environment with the predatory grace of a professional hit squad. They didn't need the flashy theatricality of a thriller movie. They operated with the cold, silent efficiency of a white-collar crime investigation, documenting Calabri's path, his gait, and the widening gaps in his security detail. Junie Bird signaled from a shadowed alleyway, his eyes never leaving Calabri's broad back. The tracker was synchronized with the ticking of Bumpy's invisible clock. Illinois Gordon moved parallel on the opposite side of the street, his massive frame blending into the darkness of the brownstone stoops, while Quick Lewis prepared the vehicle that would serve as Calabri's final transport. The suspense grew thick, not because Calabri was in danger of a shootout, but because so utterly convinced of safety, to light a dominating a face filled with triumphant arrogance, announcing the 3 shadows closing the perimeter. The investigation into Vinnie Calabre's movements was now complete. He had reached the corner of 120th Street exactly 48 minutes after the spit. The city lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for his ankles. Calabri checked his watch, mocking Bumpy's warning one last time. He thought he was the one holding the stopwatch, but as the 3-second blackout hit the corner, he finally realized the truth. The grace period was over. The response was no longer a theory. It was a physical force. Before his heart could beat a 50th time, the shadows lunged, and the man who thought he was a king became a ghost. The 3-second blackout at the corner of 126th Street was the perfect cover for a crime that functioned with the precision of a surgical investigation. Before the streetlights could hum back to life, Vincent Calabri had been neutralized and vanished into the back of a black sedan. His 4 bodyguards left staring at an empty sidewalk like characters in a thriller movie who had missed the final act. The vehicle moved through the city like a ghost, crossing into the desolate industrial wasteland of Red Hook. Here, the air was thick with the scent of salt and rusted iron, a place where the city's white-collar crime investigation stopped and the brutal reality of the underworld began.